Hello, hello! Future Ben here, coming from some clearly cold, post-apocalyptic world where it makes more sense for me to carry around a little facial scruff and has nothing to do with the fact that I've been lazy for the past few days. I wanted to add a small forward here based on some of the great conversations I've had following last week's episode where I reviewed Nevernight. First and foremost, thank you to everyone who reached out to me. I was extremely nervous in critically reviewing a New York Times bestseller as harshly as I did, and all of your messages and conversations that we had really reinforced that my opinions are valid. And I enjoyed all the discussions that we had about this novel and its flaws. I did want to expand on two issues that I glossed over in that review, which are definitely going to be exacerbated through the follow-up sequels, Dark Dawn and Godsgrave. And I don't really mention them in the reviews themselves, but I do want to include them here because they were brought up as significant reasons why people decide to not finish this novel. The first is the positive spin that the book gives on body dysmorphia. Mia goes through a magical transformation which changes her appearance and makes her quote-unquote more attractive, and only then is she able to pursue her crush. That is a terrible message and a terrible takeaway from Nevernight. Mia commented on how everyone was treating her differently now that her appearance had changed, but that is as far as the novel took it. That message could and did cause distress among readers, because it tells them to change your appearance to be with the person you want to be with. That is an oversimplification of a complex set of scenes, but the novels never dive deeper into this. They could easily have stretched this out into a meaningful theme rather than just a superficial change. The other issue is the sexual content, which crosses well into self-indulgent. That alone was one of the reasons why many readers didn't get past the first chapter of the first novel. Even the readers who did enjoy this novel and this series needed to look past those moments and utterly disregard them to find satisfaction from the read. While my videos and reviews focus more on the story being told rather than a single or set of scenes best described as smut, I did want to include that disclaimer here as a reason to not pick up the novel. So there you have it. If either of those issues are triggering for you, then they are another reason to not pick up the series. With that out of the way, here's my review of the best of the bad bunch in this trilogy, which is Godsgrave. Hello, hello! I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write, where I give questionable writing advice through running metaphors. Today, I'll be reviewing the second novel in J. Kristoff's Nevernight Chronicles, known as Godsgrave, and discussing whether or not I think you should read it. I'll try and steer clear from spoilers, but as this is the second novel in the series, there will be a decent amount of them for the first novel, Nevernight. Godsgrave continues Mia's tale of revenge in the established dark fantasy world of Nevernight. Now a trained assassin, the plot of Godsgrave shifts as Mia becomes a gladiator for the sole purpose of murdering two people she blames for her family's imprisonment and execution. J. Kristoff's captivating language carried me through to turn most of the pages, yet beneath the colorful imagery and fun Italian-styled settings, this was a predictable and standard blood-soaked story. The novel succeeded as a sequel by expanding the world, and in a lot of ways, the issues I had with Nevernight were resolved. The meandering plot of Nevernight was replaced with a clear purpose for Godsgrave. Everything Mia does directly moves her closer to the goal of killing her two targets. Much like the assassin school of the first novel, the concept of gladiator games should fascinate me, but I found them to be lacking. The arenas and elaborate battles were intended to be these massive spectacles, but they felt like they were only included in the book because they were cool ideas, thus making them fall flat for me. One stadium in particular used giant set pieces that moved and transformed with technology that wasn't present anywhere else in the series. As the arena was transforming, I couldn't help but think that the scene was indulgent and underwhelming. In terms of storytelling, the novel begins with an active hook and then works backwards by shoving backstory down our throats. The obvious hook strategy used in Nevernight was applied here to a similar effect. If told linearly, the hook would have occurred later, allowing for a much stronger emotional buildup. As written, I felt like the hook chapter was only there to raise initial tension. Thus, that had the opposite effect on me as I cared less about Mia and her predicament. The initial mystery carrying through the first chapter and first third of Godsgrave revolved around why Mia would allow herself to be enslaved and enter the gladiator pits, and why she would willingly work with someone who betrayed her in the last novel. Neither of these hit home, as I assumed, rightly so, that Mia was there to kill Sceva and Duomo, which means the initial chapters didn't need to devote so many pages to justify the why. Much like in Nevernight, the split narrative between the past and present fell flat for me as I didn't need to know her backstory, making those scenes feel like padded word counts. As for the characters Mia meets, they seem to be playing out roles to push the plot and drama forward, to the point where several act mind-bogglingly against their own established motivations for questionable reasons. For example, one person's primary goal is to ensure that the gladiators survive, and yet they go out of their way to hamstring Mia. Though Mia was purchased for a bankrupting sum of money, the person in charge of training the gladiators refused to let her fight in a style which suited her, trying to mold her into something she's not. When Mia was obviously too physically weak to excel at sword and shield combat, it set her up to die in her initial matches, which would have sent the entire gladiator group into ruin. It's not until more than halfway through the novel that the instructor has a plot point to start caring about Mia, and thus allow her to use the weapons and fighting style she already proved to be skilled in. Forcing Mia to fight in a style and with weapons that kept her off balance seemed like a waste destined to get her killed. Were it not for her ability to use magic, she would have died long before the instructor's change of heart. Throughout those early fighting bouts, I kept questioning why the instructor refused to let Mia use her assets, namely her agility and cunning, instead forcing her to rely on physical brawn she doesn't possess. The other accompanying characters seemed like actors in a play to plod the plot along. I'll be taking a deep dive into how the character developments work against Godsgrave and the other two novels in the series in my spoiler-filled wrap-up coming in 2 weeks, so be sure to check out that video for all of my full explanations on how these issues could have been resolved. Godsgrave attempted to obscure a traitor and murderer using the same tricks from Nevernight. And once again, before a betrayal or murder even happened, I knew who the traitor was because of how a specific scene played out. Mia, a trained assassin well-versed in misdirection, didn't even bother questioning why the primary suspect's motivations were contradictory until somebody else brought it up to her. This made me think much worse of her as a character and of her intelligence, in that she should have been able to piece together who the traitor was, even though she wasn't involved in the scene which gave it away. The fact that she does come through at the end of the novel doesn't really make up for this middling sense of drama. Hey, Future Ben here, and I want to expand on the faults of Mia's character. She is a trained assassin, and we are inside of her head for most of this book, but at no point does she question the information being presented to her, or consider that any of it might be false. When the bodies started piling up, she should have immediately sought out answers to who the traitor is, so that way she could dispose of them and save more lives. Rather than making the twist be the identity of the traitor, it felt like the twist was that Mia was able to figure out who the traitor was. We were in her head, and we never experienced her piecing together the information or sifting through the falsified information. That made it feel like misdirection meant only for the reader rather than the characters. Shifting to my biggest gripe of this novel, we are repeatedly told that Sceva is evil. Yet for the number of times that we're told this, we never really see evidence of him doing anything that's truly evil. Skeva has yet to be portrayed as a dictator worthy of being deposed, making me inclined to believe that Mia's father was misguided in his revolution attempt. Sure, Skeva's a villain to Mia and her family, making him the novel's antagonist, but we're never actually shown how he is a bad ruler or any acts that would really be defined as evil. The nation's treatment and dependence on slaves is repugnant, but that was a pre-existing condition and one which Skeva doesn't seem to be exacerbating. In fact, by the second novel, all Skeva really seems guilty of is clinging to power as a senator for more terms than has been allotted, and torturing and executing the members involved in a failed rebellion. Shifting to the writing style, I kept asking why certain scenes and descriptions were included and kept coming up with very little. Be it the prologue or verbose purple prose, this novel would have been improved by being severely trimmed. Moreover, the premise of Godsgrave is flawed. Mia's goal is to win a gladiator competition so that she will be personally freed and pardoned by Skeva and Duomo, where she then intends to kill them. To do so, she needs to earn enough victories and notoriety in the upcoming games to make it to the final competition. That's why the plan is flawed. The Church of Assassins and Skeva and Duomo know Mia is out there. Having a nation cheering for someone who matches Mia's description means that her targets and those she's trying to hide from should know her whereabouts at every given moment. She does nothing to hide her identity, and pretty soon the entire city starts cheering for the new gladiator known as Crow, which is her family crest. This is anything but stealthy. Mia's plan was doomed to be discovered, which is fine because it was made by teenage assassins, except that it was endorsed by a senior assassin who wants Mia to succeed. Throughout the novel, I kept thinking about how, even if this bad plan does work, there's no way that her targets wouldn't know she's coming. Skeva, Duomo, and the Church of Assassins have countless sources of information which Mia already knew about, meaning that she should know that she wouldn't be able to sneak up on her targets by becoming a national hero in the gladiator games. Bad plans can work, but this one in particular made me think of Mia and those who followed her as naive. And in a lot of ways, I started rooting against her as the story progressed. This is a mild spoiler, but anytime the POV shifts from Mia, expect a badly conceived fake out. I'll be going much more into these moments and scenes in my spoiler-filled wrap-up, but the sudden shifts only serve to highlight the misdirection rather than hide the betrayals and deceits. My last point is that if you didn't know that a dead body smells like piss and feces, well, Mia's narration will tell you numerous times. This is something I wanted to include in my review of Nevernight, but it holds true for this novel as well. There is more to telling a grimdark fantasy than in copying and pasting George Carlin's 7 words you can never say on TV. In closing, Godsgrave is more entertaining than Nevernight, though equally as flawed. I'm going to go ahead and give this a solid rating of 3 out of 5. If you liked Nevernight, then you should consider reading the sequel. If you didn't like Nevernight or didn't bother reading it, then let this one pass you by. I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write. Have you read Godsgrave, and what did you think of it? Do you agree with my opinions, or is everything I said wrong? Let me know in those comments below. I post my running and writing thoughts on social media, so be sure to follow along and join in with your own comments. Next week, I'll be reviewing the finale of the trilogy known as Dark Dawn. Is it like Back to the Future 3, or did it disappoint expectations like Alien 3? Find out in my next video what I think of the conclusion to the Nevernight Chronicles. See you next time. Until then, consider reading Godsgrave and judging it for yourself.